Welcome to The Corner, La Source's digital show dedicated to the sport and entertainment industry. Every 2 weeks, we invite a professional to share their experience, background, and challenges. The sport industry moves fast, and having their insights is the best way to keep up to speed. Welcome to The Corner.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of The Corner International. Today, we're very happy to welcome on our podcast, Tim Clark. Hi, Tim. How are you?
I'm good, Sam. How about you?
Very good. Very good. Can't complain. Happy to be joined by JB, too. Hey, JB.
Hi, guys. How are you guys doing?
Hey, JB.
Can't complain. Can't complain. Look, great to have you here, Tim. For our European listeners who might not know what NASCAR is, because it's a very American sport. No, all jokes aside, Tim Clark is joining us from NASCAR. Very happy to have you here. And would just love for you to introduce yourself to our community so they understand a little bit better who you are, what's your background, and get things going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be with you guys. So I have been with NASCAR for the better part of 10 years. And I guess my day job is to oversee our digital business. And I say my day job because I've accumulated a bunch of part-time after hour jobs over the last couple of years. So esports and sports betting and content and original productions, as well as our consumer data strategy and looking for ways that we can innovate, whether that be through content or experiences or whatnot. I mean, you mentioned European fans. Our motorsports fans domestically won't let me go 5 minutes without referencing the F1 show on Netflix. So we're just trying to do our best to compete over here.
Very nice, very nice. And what's funny with your background? So basically, you're telling us that. First of all, you're telling us that NASCAR works like a startup. It feels like very familiar to do 15 jobs at the same time.
It's interesting, Sam. Honestly, that's the reason that A, I took the job in the first place here, and B, the reason that I think I've been here a while is exactly that it's, it's an established brand. It's an established company that's got obviously a very long history, but from an innovation standpoint, I think we try to reinvent that fan experience on a fairly regular basis. So I think that kind of entrepreneurial portion of my job is really what keeps me going.
Interesting. And so what made you come to the sports industry? Because you were originally in the retail industry. So that there's quite a big gap between retail and NASCAR. So how do you come about it? Did you plan at all times to start working in sports?
It's interesting. I think had I known that there were opportunities to work in sports, I would have always worked in sports. But I think for a decent chunk of my career, the sports industry, and you guys know this, it's different than it used to be. I mean, the jobs that used to exist in sports, are much more. There are a whole lot more of them than there were, in kind of the early days as digital was first, becoming a thing, right? There were a lot of jobs on the agency side. There were a lot of jobs on the brand and retail side. E-commerce was really where I got my start in digital. And I eventually went to work for Michael Rubin's company, Pre-Fanatics, which was called GSI. And that business was focused on digital and marketing and e-commerce for all of the domestic sports leagues. And so of my clients, NASCAR was one of them. And that job was incredible. I mean, to be able to work with all of the leagues across NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, and NASCAR was an incredible opportunity, and ultimately what led to the job I have today.
So that's how you made the switch, right? You're working as a client for them, managing was it more the e-commerce platform at the time, or what was it mainly that you were dealing with?
Yeah, it was specifically performance marketing and what, that I guess means in more, widely used terms is anything that drove an ROI. So as opposed to kind of brand awareness or big marketing swings that are, just designed to be visible. The channels that I worked on in that business were ones designed to drive a return on investment. So, think paid search or comparison shopping engines, or anything that would lead to someone buying a product from the GSI or ultimately the Fanatics business was a big part of my role.
Interesting. And so actually, did you manage to get a lot of takeaways from your previous job going into NASCAR and being able to transpose what was, like all the shopping behaviors from a retail company moving into the sports industry? Because every time you talk about digital, what's the ROI against it, right? Or how do you make me save money? So how much were you able to transpose?
Yeah, Sam, it was a dream come true. Like, it was a dream job. And I mean that honestly, because I had been, I had gotten in digital and e-commerce in, the fairly early days. And, all of that was designed, especially in retail, around putting investment where it's going to lead to a conversion and lead to a sale. So, I was very familiar with that world and felt very comfortable in that environment and working with digital channels that were going to drive conversion and drive revenue. And then being asked to translate that into sports, which I've loved, for my entire life, where do I sign up? When can I start?
But it seems, Tim, that what you said right at the beginning was the portfolio at NASCAR was a bit bigger in terms of digital. It feels like it's way broader from what you used to do before.
For sure. And I think, my job, the first job I had at NASCAR, the job I was hired at, was director of optimization. And what that meant was it was, and again, that was part of the draw, was that it was purposely vague, right? We were launching the digital business. So NASCAR had brought digital rights back in-house from Turner, and was going to build their digital business from scratch. And, the job that I was asked to do was basically be the person that could, mind the store, so to speak, from end to end of, how are the developers connecting to the front end, and how's the mobile app connecting to the core web experience, and what's the live experience like on race days versus what the, Monday through Friday experience looks like, which again, very much appealed to me of, how do you take this, this notion of digital and fan engagement, but make it a bit broader across, the digital space, which was at the time and continues to be today one that's ever changing and evolving at a pretty rapid pace.
Interesting. We'll get back to that user journey piece, because one of the big elements that all the leagues are trying to tackle is how to not only have their users connect on the weekend, on game day, but how do they tell the longer narrative. But maybe taking one step back, can you explain a little bit how NASCAR competition is organized, how many races, how many pilots, so that everybody on this podcast understands it?
Sure. Yeah. So there are 36 point races throughout the course of the season. And the season starts, obviously with our version of the Super Bowl, the Daytona 500, which is in February. And then we'll conclude in early November this year with our championship race in Phoenix. So 36 point races, the last 10 of which are playoff races. So we'll start the season with, anywhere from 36 to 38 to 40 drivers. And throughout the season, they're attempting to qualify for playoff spots. So there are 16 drivers that qualify for the playoffs. And then through that 10-week playoff, there are elimination rounds, so that when you get to the last race of the season, you've essentially got 4 drivers that are competing for the championship. And last race of the season, the championship race in Phoenix, of those 4 drivers, the one that finishes in the highest position is crowned the champion. You guys are familiar with motorsports. It's the format of playoffs is familiar to fans of kind of the stick and ball sports. But what is a little bit different is you're down to 4 drivers that are competing for the championship, but the other drivers are still out there and competing in the race. So, it's a bit of a little bit different in that regard, where you've got all of the competitors that will race throughout the entirety of the season you're just kind of winnowing down that playoff field, if you will.
I was actually going to ask about that because I never had in mind a race with only 4 cars and NASCAR. It's a completely different sport, whether there are four cars or 16, right?
Right.
Nice. And so that's interesting. And the mix and match is actually really interesting to understand the model that you guys came up with. And just overall, how, obviously in the US, there are the 4 big competitions, right? That would be the NFL, the Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NFL. We had a great talk with Chris Schlosser from the MLS of what was their positioning and how they compared with the rest of the big 4. What is the positioning of NASCAR? How do you live alongside those big competitions? It's obviously a much more different sport than soccer would be to all those other ones. But we'd love to understand a little bit what's your angle to capture huge communities and stay relevant to all the younger and older audiences.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple of things that I would say. One, I think I guess the league structure in the U.S. I suppose in some ways, maybe many ways, we're quote unquote competitors to one another, but we all have a really good relationship. I've known Chris Schlosser for years, and we talk fairly regularly. And I think that's the case with other league counterparts. So I think, there's some, some degree of competitiveness, but I also think that sports fans are sports fans. And I think it's rare that sports fans pick one sport to follow and that's it. Right. I think there are generally a lot of crossover. There may be one that they prefer or one that's their favorite, but typically what we found through our research is that there are sports fans in the US that are following multiple leagues. So, our audience is incredibly loyal and incredibly passionate. I think the balance that we spend a lot of time focusing on is, you've got this loyal generational fan base that will stick with you through thick and thin. And I think we feel like we have a responsibility to manage the sport in such a way that you are still delivering on the things that are expected by that loyal fan base that's been with you from day one, while also making some changes periodically to freshen things up for new fans, because you can't pick one over the other, right? You don't want all 4 fans, but you also don't want all new fans. You gotta figure out where the balance is, and I think we spend probably more time than most things on that topic in particular.
And from your research, it seemed like, sorry, Sam, I'm just tapping in because I'm just interested on that, is what's the hook? I mean, I can see clearly the loyal fan, but, we all love different sports, and I think you're right. But what makes like a non-loyal NASCAR fan coming to your different platforms or to your shows, or what's the evidence from your research on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 things. One is the live experience of a NASCAR race is, I think, in our opinion, and I think our research will show this, it is unlike any other sporting event that you will experience. I mean, the power and the size and the sounds and the smells. So if we can get a fan to experience a race in person, we feel really, really strongly about our ability to retain them as a fan. I think the other thing that is kind of leading to that curiosity for a new fan is star power. And I think that's probably the same for other sports as well, right? I mean, you've got to have personalities that people are interested in and want to be around and want to follow and want to learn more about. So, I think as compelling as, a race and race cars and engines and all of the things that come with motorsports are, I also think, being curious about, wanting to know more about Bubba Wallace or Denny Hamlin or Chase Elliott. I mean, that's really what's going to move the sport forward, certainly in a way that's going to make people curious of, who these guys are and what the competition looks like that they're involved in.
Mm.
And out of curiosity, what's the reach of a top athlete, competing at NASCAR? Like,
right.
like in Europe right now, there's obviously Messi coming to PSG and completely changing the scope of things when it comes to sponsors, fandom, adding 20 million followers to the social media accounts, etc. What's the scale of reach of a typical NASCAR, of a top NASCAR athlete?
Yeah, so it's probably a more complex answer than I could articulate, and I guess what I mean by that is, the size and scale of a Messi shutting down the city of Paris, right, is is different, right? So, I think I think it's not that, obviously, but what it is look, I mean, there are 70 million ish NASCAR fans in the US. So I think the way that you're able to interact with your driver on a one-to-one basis, I think is critical to our success. And then not only the fan engagement, but as you know, if you've ever seen one of our races, it's very sponsor and partner centric. So the notion of that scale and that interaction happening for the partners and the sponsors is equally important. And I think where those two intersect is, you've got this fan base that understands that these partners are allowing their favorite driver to race. So, it's really not comparable to, call it an NBA, where there may be a jersey sponsor, and that sponsor is obviously very supportive of that team and that organization. And, I think fans recognize that. But, when fans see Denny Hamlin with a FedEx logo on his fire suit and on the side of his race car, they understand that the investment that's coming from FedEx is allowing him to race. So, I think in terms of the reach, you've got, it's interesting to see what happens from, the broader sport of NASCAR down to an individual driver level, and then what their social media channels allow them to do. And
just on that, do you have because I fully see the picture you just given, but in terms of demographics, do you have the age, everybody's talking about engaging the younger fans, the Gen Z and all of this. You mentioned the NBA. I know the MLS is one of the 4 leagues who have the bright future, let's say, whereas maybe an MLB is not the same, and NFL as well. So I was just wondering, is that something you're looking at as well in terms of how you speak to that audience, or how you try to bring, maybe they are loyal because it's also something maybe with the family that you're watching. I really see it like this with the father and the son, on the NASCAR and the live experience. But for the non-loyal fan, I was wondering if that's also a target and that you're trying to activate around that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, JB, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So, I think the average NASCAR fan is older, right? Now, I think in many ways, I think we've been conditioned to think that that's a negative. But here's the juxtaposition that, 62-year-old fan looks awful on a piece of paper, and the 19-year-old looks great on a piece of paper. But when you need them to invest in something or buy something or subscribe to something, it's not always as much fun as it seems to do that with the 19-year-old, right? So, and I'm not suggesting that we would pick one versus the other, but back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, I think the scale is important and the balance is important. And to your question, JB, I think it's, when we put classic races on our Facebook channel, they perform exceptionally well. And the average fan of our Facebook page is a little bit older. Now, when we take a tongue-in-cheek 101 video and put it on TikTok before we go to Talladega or Daytona, those numbers go through the roof, and the average viewer of those videos is significantly younger. So I think, to your exact point, that's the balance for us is to make sure that we're providing the right content, the right experience to the right fan on the right platform at the right time. And that doesn't mean it's a there's really a finish line to that. That is a, day by day, hour by hour, week by week endeavor of trying to get that recipe right. Because it's not just as simple as saying, all right, well, this content's going to go here and we're going to reach the young fans, and this content's going to go here and we're going to reach the older diehard fans, and we're all set. I mean, that evolves, as you guys know, really rapidly. But I think that's part of the fun. It's part of the challenge to find the right mix of all of those tools.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's about so much more than the platform. It's about the content you put on which platform to attract which typology. So there is indeed so much to it. Getting back to the R&D piece, which is something that I know is close to you, and obviously innovation and new technologies are essential for your competition, right? Because from one year to the other, the cars have to get better, faster to be able to compete and challenge against each other. But I guess from a league perspective, your innovations are a bit different, right? The teams must be focusing on the technical improvements. You must be you must be working on the format improvements and differences. What are the types of innovation that you have seen very impactful in the recent years that you are proud of as the governing body of NASCAR?
Yeah, so a couple have come to mind. One is the evolution of stages. And stages was just, as opposed to saying, this is going to be a 400 lap race and we're going to start at lap 1 and we're going to end at lap 400, and whatever happens in between, so be it. Stages was an attempt to do two things. One, to make it more familiar for new fans. If you watch a football game, if you watch a soccer match, if you watch an NBA game, they're divided into segments, and it may be halves, it may be quarters. In the case of baseball, it may be innings, but there are kind of bite-sized segments of that game. With a race, it was just, again, it's just a lot of laps. And the evolution of stages, while it may not sound, like a big deal, it's done a couple of things. One, if you're a new viewer and you tune in and it says at the bottom of the screen, lap 3 of 400, there's got to be a mental part of, all right, I'm going to turn this off and maybe I'll turn it on, closer to the end. But if at that same point of the race, if it says lap 3 of, 40, you're probably more inclined to stick around and watch that. And ideally, watching the first stage then, compels you to watch the second stage and so on and so forth. So I think little nuanced things like that have been really effective. And then, there's two that we'll see going into next season that I think we're really excited about. One is a brand new race car, literally from every piece, every part. There's a brand new race car that will roll out next year for the first time. We've been testing it since last year. Quite frankly, it was originally supposed to debut this year, and then obviously, like a lot of things, COVID had other plans. So we'll roll that out in 2022. But it is a brand new car from the bottom up that each of the teams will now be working off of and trying to compete with one another and trying to be faster than the other team. The other one is again not technically a big innovation, but we're going to run a race at the LA Coliseum. We just announced that, and the notion of putting stock cars inside of the LA Coliseum, which has hosted Olympics and Super Bowls and football games and baseball games, but certainly never a stock car race. I think the visuals of that are going to be incredible, and as will the notion of taking our sport into a market that we have traditionally not had a presence. And it's one of our top 2 media markets, LA, and we've got a race in Fontana, which is a little ways outside of the city. But again, I think we are cognizant of the fact that we are not in a position, nor do I, quite frankly, believe any sports league is, to sit back and hope the fans come to them. We've got to go to the fans every chance that we get. We raced in Austin, Texas last year. will race in Los Angeles next year. And I think you'll continue to see things like that from us where, we not only want to evolve on the technical side and the competition side, but things as simple as the race format and the schedule are equally as important.
That's a funny one, not a funny one, but a very interesting one because, from a startup perspective, we always think about technical improvements and technological improvement, but the two examples that you gave, and especially the one around the race format, obviously had a huge impact. And how were you able to measure that? Because obviously, beyond the fun and beyond the perceived value, how did you actually see it have an impact on your community? Were you able to measure that extensively?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. First of all, the social media engagement through the entirety of the race, as opposed to those big spikes at the beginning and the big spikes at the end, that curve kind of flattened, right? Yeah. So we're able to see the engagement on second screen or social media, and similarly with the broadcast. Our ratings over the last few years have been solid, right? I mean, TV numbers are not a perfect science, and I think everyone is trying to figure out measurement of households and share and rating points and all of those sorts of things in a world where fewer and fewer and fewer people are actually just watching traditional television. So, I think the fact that our ratings have been in a really strong spot over the last couple of years, including looking at quarter hours as you're introducing those stage races, I think we feel we're on the right track. Yeah. No pun intended.
Super interesting. Nice. And in general, is there some kind of innovation that you share with the other big motorsports, or that like you get inspired from, or you feel they get inspired from? Mm-hmm. Is there like an overall approach of motorsports leagues, or is it something where you really work in silos because different continents, different interests, and not really something that is happening right now?
Yeah, so I think there's much more collaboration and coordination now than there was even a few years ago. And a couple of examples, NASCAR acquired another stock car racing series called ARCA a few years ago, and now we have the ability to coordinate with them and work with them at a number of levels. Not only are the competition groups working together, but we move their website onto our platform, and we're able to take some of the technology that we've used on our races to power their apps and websites. Same for IMSA. Sport car racing has had a pretty impressive growth boon over the last few years, and we've been able to work very closely with the folks at IMSA, and then more recently with someone like F1. We did a Rocket League partnership earlier this season that we rolled out jointly on Rocket League with F1 and NASCAR. And I think it was unusual for people to kind of see, F1 and NASCAR interacting with one another, in kind of the virtual world and the digital and social world. But, at the end of the day, I back to what we were talking about with the other sports leagues. Yeah, I think there's always this inherent degree of competition where everyone wants more fans and wants more attention and more exposure. Yeah. But I also think there's recognition that if you are a motorsport enthusiast, that there's enough to go around. I think everyone that we've dealt with, whether it be Formula One, whether it be IndyCar, whether it be IMSA, ARCA, NHRA and the like, everyone fundamentally agrees that the success of each of those individually is better for the collective, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there are a lot of new formats of motorsports that are coming up, right? When you think about the ESC or even the renewal that there is around the what is it called, World Air Race, there are a lot of motorsports that are actually gathering a lot of interest and that are becoming much more popular than one of the previous conversations we were having were about certain sports disappearing from the Olympics in 2024. New audiences are looking for new types of formats of competitions, and just the expectations of the younger generations are obviously changing.
Well, and we pay attention. One that I didn't mention was we pay a lot of attention to Formula E, because I think the notion of electric or hybrid racing, there is a big future in that, and I think it's one that has been on our radar for some time, and I think the conversations internally in that regard have certainly increased over the past few years. But to your point, it's maybe not just the combustion engine version of motorsports. I mean, you've got Drone Racing League, you've got Formula E. I mean, you've got the notion of fans enjoying the competition of racing is going to take on multiple forms, and the more we can explore those types of scenarios, the better for our long-term health.
Yep.
I mean, that's on Formula E. I was wondering whether you have an R&D department really looking at these questions, because I guess, and that's something, I guess also that's on your radar around environmental issues and all the CSR aspect of things. Do you have some kind of an R&D, or do you work with universities in terms of innovations to actually push the boundaries on the electric side of things, or do you work closely maybe with Formula E themselves, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the answer to your question, JB, is yes. So we've got a group within competition and R&D and innovation that is actively exploring those things. I think we recognize, and I think what makes people nervous when they hear that, specifically the kind of the core fans or the hardcore fans, is I think they think that means there's just going to be a switch one day where we'll take what you're seeing today on track, and then they'll show up the next day and it's going to be electric racing. I don't think that's the case. I think what I think our responsibility is to your point, from a research and development standpoint, is to explore those types of opportunities and explore what other series are doing, what other motorsports are doing, so that we could start to explore running series like that or races like that, and then over time figure out what that right balance is. I don't think anyone believes that it's an either or, right? That you have to pick the way we do it now, or you have to pick electrification. I think it's more evaluating all of the different things that we could do in the motorsport space and getting to that right mix. I mean, there's so many reasons of, whether it be environmental issues, whether it be things that are more familiar to younger audiences or younger fans. There's so many things to consider when kind of putting together what a competition series in 10 years or 5 years is going to look like.
Yes, it does feel like those are able to cohabit, but just in general, for the moment, the traditional motorsports such as yours and Formula One are still way ahead, and it's maybe also because of the maturity of the businesses. Although, and coming back to Europe, there was a small decline of Formula One, but there is definitely a renewed interest right now in MotoGP and Formula One. And we know that a lot of it was because of what you mentioned earlier, because a Netflix was capable of putting in place with Formula One a great series that attracted the newer audiences and gave a whole other angle to it that got the wives of a motorsports fan to also start looking into it and enjoying the competition in some way. Do you have plans of doing that with NASCAR in terms of bringing the brand over? I know that I'm half American, but lived all my life in France. I started being interested in the NFL because of All or Nothing, right? So the impact of those types of series are super important and very different than your traditional day-to-day. Is that something that you're looking at to expand the brand worldwide?
It is, and I think there are some examples of that. Already we've got a series that we sanction in Europe. We've got a series that we sanction in Mexico that is incredibly popular. I think it in many ways flies under the radar, but we've been really pleased with the traction that we've gotten in Mexico. We've run races traditionally in Canada. Again, back to the dirty word of COVID, that has been a bit of a challenge this year, certainly. But the simple answer to your question, Sam, is yes. I mean, I think we realize that there are some some issues and some difficulty in taking our cars. It's a whole lot easier to put an NFL roster on an airplane and fly them overseas and find a football field to compete on, right?
Yeah.
Than it is to do that with NASCAR race cars and engineers and drivers. It's a little bit difficult, but obviously Formula One is able to travel the world and has had a lot of success in doing that. I think we have a lot of similar conversations of, I think NASCAR will be at its core a U.S. based league, but our expansion internationally is a big part of our future. And I think, again, COVID is not an excuse, but it's the protocols that have been put in place by all of us, not just NASCAR, right? But all of us are dealing with similar challenges. I think that's created an additional barrier that obviously we weren't anticipating. But our international expansion over the next 3 to 5 years, I think is going to be pretty special.
Tim, out of the blue question is, you mentioned expansion. Will you try to go into the city center, or is that something, Formula E is really on the rise also because, you are in iconic cities, you are in the city center, you're close to many people, you don't have to take your car to go to a racetrack or to do like 1 hour or something like that. I think that's an amazing value proposition today. Is that something NASCAR has in mind, or is it more like first to stay close to your values and to the sports itself, and then you will see how it expands? Or is that something out of your radar for the moment?
No, it's a really good question, and we talked a little bit about the LA Coliseum, and that is a big, that's a big part of this, right? Is to see what are the challenges, and what are the challenges we know, and what are the challenges that we're going to learn along the way with doing an event like that, right? The noise is going to be the first one, right? Being at a NASCAR event and being at a NASCAR track, the noise is really cool. Doing that in the city center may not be as cool as I think it is to the residents. But I think the LA Coliseum will be a big learning experience. We played around with a track last year on iRacing, actually, that was a road course through downtown Chicago. And doing that virtually was because we, would love to do things like that in real life, but we just want to do them smartly, because there's obviously a lot that goes into that. But I think all of us, if you're looking at the schedule over the next few years, I think would hope that we can go to metropolitan areas and figure out a way to run a race that, to your point, is similar to what F1 is able to do. That's kind of in the heart of the city, as opposed to, enough distance that we don't get noise ordinances.
And so now jumping potentially to the last topic that we want to raise with you on the podcast, we want to raise a lot beyond it. But as far as the digital engagement is concerned, is your audience more and more digital, or are most of your consumers still massively on linear platforms? Yeah,
look, our TV audience is substantial, right? I mean, it is a big audience, and I think I have thought about this and I've wrestled with this topic honestly since I started at NASCAR, because I spent a lot of time wringing my hands over the fact that we weren't a kind of a quote unquote highlight sport, right? So take the NBA, for example. There may be a terrible game in the NBA, and the entirety of that game may be awful, and one team may lose by 30. But during the course of that game, LeBron is going to have half a dozen highlights. Steph Curry is going to have some highlights. Kevin Durant's going to have highlights. And, I think I certainly spent a lot of time thinking, man, how do we compete with that? And I think the realization was we're not, but that's okay. That's not who we have to be. We don't have to be a highlight driven sport. I think what our fans have proven is that they're willing to make that investment over time, to really understand the storylines and understand the nuances of the sport and understand, one strategy from one group of drivers versus the strategy over the other group of drivers that's going to play out over the course of 100 or 150 laps. So I think when you look at our audience, they're certainly the vast majority are, in the stands or on linear television. But I also think that what we see during the week is really, really strong engagement on our social platforms because you've got the group that isn't able to attend the race or is watching, but also want to immerse themselves in as much information as they can. So it's not just watching the broadcast, it's also the broadcast with, the mobile app in hand so that they can follow, tire fall off or pit strategies or pit cycles or whatever the case may be. And then during the week, social media engagement has continued to climb for us the last few years. So I guess that it's a long-winded answer to your question, Sam, but I think it's something that a few years ago, if you had asked me that question, I would have gotten defensive and thought, oh, well, it's tough for us to not operate like the other sports do. But now I look at it as very much a positive and very much a differentiator of how sticky our audience is and how much more invested they are than just being, satiated by an 8-second clip on Instagram the next day.
Yeah. And actually, maybe one thing that's closer to you, or at least interesting, is how do you do the arbitrage between the content that you put on social media, where a large amount of your community is, and the content you put on your proprietary platform to gather more and more information on those users to, have a better stickiness to your sport and at least be in more control than you might be on social media?
That's exactly right. And look, I mean, a lot of that is going to be driven by technology. So, a recent example is some of our drivers were in the car with wearable fitness trackers. So, during the broadcast, you're able to watch an event unfold, which great. That watching that on broadcast is great. We can put that clip on our social channels, great. But then almost like that third dimension becomes showing that same incident with driver heart rate as they're going through it, where one is able to maintain a more even heart rate, where another one is spiking as they're driving through it, right? And that becomes yet another thing to talk about. So to your point, it's not only differentiating this moment versus this moment per platform, but it's this moment and how can you tell it 3 different ways on 3 different platforms.
Interesting. And so out of curiosity, how do you allocate the resource to one or the other, right? Because it has to be a question of, do I want, I guess
Right.
the language might be simplified on social media so that it reaches the volume and you get really that volume of audience. And then it's more for the top tier fans that you have a better narrative, et cetera. But also there's a question of, why would you put more money into the content that you put on your proprietary platform when the most value you are getting is from social media? You know what I mean? So how do you set that up? How do you make those decisions?
Well, I think it's a balance, but the other thing that kind of comes to mind is, who you put in those positions, right? Because if we're looking at our production group that requires a little bit more experience and requires a little bit more intimate knowledge of the sport to produce that type of content, then I look at the group that we have on our social media team, which is just a phenomenal group of young professionals, which, by the way, were hired without any previous context in NASCAR. And that was done intentionally, right? I mean, it does us no good to go get a bunch of people that live, eat, sleep, breathe NASCAR to try to tell the NASCAR story on social media platforms. I'd rather we communicate in a way that is more familiar with those platforms and the audiences that use those platforms. So I think the investment is not only in the people, but I think it's putting the right people on the right platforms so that dialogue is done the right way.
Interesting. And so that was part of the success of NASCAR, also making their younger audiences more and more engaged and keep them coming on the platform. I guess that's part of the overall strategy that you guys put in place, is bringing those new youngsters that put new type of formats of content without too many guidelines. And that was successful in the recent strategy of having a faithful younger generation, younger community.
For sure. I have found that the more successful we're going to be on our social platforms is equal to the less involvement from me. So the more I get out of the way and let those guys do their thing, the better off we're going to be. They don't need the middle-aged guy tapping on the shoulder like, hey, are you sure this is the right format for Instagram Live?
Thinking you're understanding it, whereas you have no clue and don't have a TikTok account yourself. Yeah, starting to feel that way too.
I'm in touch with my limitations for sure.
And so maybe to finish off this this podcast, if we look further down the line, what can we hope for NASCAR in the next 5 years? Like, what are the topics that you are working on that where you would want to see a major difference, and what can we wish you?
And if I can jump into it, sorry, Tim, we've not mentioned NFTs since the beginning of this podcast, which I'm quite happy with, to be honest, because blockchain and NFTs is everywhere, or the metaverse. So, Tim, you don't have to mention them. I know your portfolio is getting bigger and bigger for the last 10 years, and that you're doing everything during the day and during the night, but it might be something else.
No, it's funny. NFTs. A colleague of mine, we were talking earlier this week. If you do in your email inbox, just do a search for NFTs and see how many emails that you've gotten since January of this year that have included that in the subject. It's that number is off the charts. But I do think that our notion of what the NASCAR future in the metaverse looks like, I am extraordinarily bullish on. I believe that, and I think it has to be done the right way, right? We can't just wildly jerk the wheel from one side to the other. And now we're doing all NFTs and blockchain and crypto and metaverse, right? But I do think that that's where we're all headed. I think that the user experience can be done in such a way that you're creating this virtual environment of real life. And I think NASCAR can play a really important role there. So I do think that's a big part of it. But I also think, we talked a lot about this, right? I think we have to continue to serve fans where they are. And that means not only in the virtual space or digital platforms or social media platforms, but also the physical spaces. I mean, JB, you asked the question about the city centers. It's such a big point for us. And I think that's why things like LA Coliseum or a Chicago street race are so exciting for us, because that, if you kind of connect the dots a little bit, right? We talked about how NASCAR fans become, really, really avid fans and long tenured fans if they can experience a race in person. Well, that notion used to be, all right, well, how are we going to get them to come to Talladega? And how are we going to get them to come to Charlotte? And how are we going to get them to come to Martinsville? And that's still going to be part of our strategy, right? But then I think the new strategy is also going to be equal amount of, all right, let's pick up the show and take it where they are. I think we're all really excited about that, because, the good thing is at the core of that is we're suggesting that we're happy with the product, right? It would be a much harder problem to solve if it were, we're not happy with the drivers or the racing or the car or the competition. Those would be harder things to fix. But, now we're just saying we're really bullish on the product. Let's just figure out how we can expose more people to it, which I'll take that challenge any day. So whether that happens in the virtual world, social world, digital world, or whatever, the drinking word is going to be next year instead of NFTs, we'll hopefully be there.
Actually, circling back on the fact that I thought that you had a very startup-oriented speech coming in, it feels like you were literally pitching a VC right now about increasing your TAM and saying we have the right fit, we just need to go for new verticals.
That's right. Exactly.
Terrific, JB. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, that is right on point, actually, as a conclusion.
Cool, Tim. It was very much fun discussing NASCAR. It's the first time I discussed NASCAR for 15 minutes in my life, I have to tell you.
That's a step in the right direction for us.
Exactly.
Same here. I think the expansion will be quite a challenge in terms of also, I was thinking when you were talking, it's in terms of like how do you take that show and that product, which is very much American, but that can please a certain population, even in Europe or in other territories. So I was just trying to figure that out in terms of like a whole new cultural experience as well that people are actually looking for as well. So good luck on that.
Well, the next challenge for me is I want to get both of you to come to a NASCAR race. So we'll just have to figure out when and where that is.
There we go. We'll take up on that invitation. Count on us.
Perfect.
Terrific. Thanks a lot, Tim. Thanks a lot for your time. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us on this new episode. Hope you liked it as much as we did. And as always, like it, share it, talk about it with your friends. You're our best supporters. Have a great one.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, guys.
Le corner.